I'm Eric, I work here at 9, I'm the lead architect, and today I want to talk about how to develop like a Linux professional Windows. It sounds a bit strange. First of all, I'm not a Windows fanboy. So I have a Mac at home. I work with Linux for a long time, but there has been some remarkable developments in Windows that made me think about doing this talk today. Let's start with a bit of history. I mean, Windows always, to the success of the operating system, they had a massive development community. But it was mostly like active within the Windows ecosystem, which traditionally meant like Visual Studio, .NET, Visual Basic, WinForms, all that stuff that gives you the churros today. There was always some kind of, well, a little bit of cross-platform development, even back then with Java, JDK, Eclipse. But generally, Microsoft didn't really like Linux. Steve Ballmer even said like Linux is like a cancer. So not really a good relationship. But of course, you know that, man. They love developers. Yep. Well, apart from that craziness, you generally had a really bad experience of running and developing applications outside of the Windows ecosystem. I mean, there was like a Python port. Some people even like compiled PHP to run on IIS. There was VirtualBox to run virtual machines, Sigwin, but as I said, for me, it was not a good development experience. And as a result, many people switched to macOS. Because like that was how Windows development looked like. And on macOS, you had like PHP Storm, or you had like Brew. You can install all the Linux packages you want to develop with. So all the good stuff from the Linux world on the Mac. But then came a very interesting move from Microsoft. And with the new CEO, Nadella, this guy said something really remarkable.
And so the way we've gone about that is on multiple layers. So for example, the Microsoft Cloud is ready for any device. You can be on iOS or Android or Windows Phone and use the cloud for your application state, for your notification, and as a backend for every application that you build across those devices. We are also a cloud that supports any OS or any container technology. So we support both Linux and Windows Server. This is something that I want to just make sure I drill home. Microsoft loves Linux. 20% of Windows, 20% of Azure is already Linux.
So that was quite remarkable, in my opinion. Because what made them suddenly say they love Linux? Well, it was obviously their shift from a pure desktop OS to cloud services, to platform as the cloud services. And obviously, we all know the cloud runs on Linux. Yeah? And Microsoft did not only say, okay, we're going to run our cloud on Linux, they also suddenly became very interested in open source technologies. And they used a lot of open source technologies, in my opinion, to just catch up. And they did not only use it, they also contributed towards open source as a return. So they developed a lot of tools. They suddenly provided Linux, contributed towards the Linux kernel. Was really a radical change there. And a little bit later, actually, they did something crazy and some really unexpected as well. They released the technology they called Windows Subsystem for Linux. In that version, you could pretty much run Linux straight on your Windows machine. And in this early version, they basically built something where they translated like all this Linux system calls onto the Windows kernel. And this move already allowed you pretty much to install Ubuntu on your Windows machine. You could run your Git, you can run your Node.js. So pretty much every package on Linux could run on Windows. And just this year, they released the next iteration, Windows Subsystem for Linux 2, and there they did a completely redesign. What they did is they don't longer translate the system calls. They actually like run a virtual machine, and it's like a real Linux kernel now. And they had like this advantage of performance, integration. I'll go more on this later. What they didn't have though is Linux on a Windows PC is still like just a command line. There's no GUI. I mean, GUI is Windows desktop. And yeah, by having that Windows Subsystem for Linux, you pretty much had all the tools from the Linux world right on Windows. And what was also interesting, and after this I jump into the demo part, is that Microsoft become really active actually in the providing of development tools itself. I mean, how many of you guys use Visual Studio Code? Oh, quite a few. So that's a Microsoft product ultimately. I mean, you probably not use it on Windows. You maybe use it on Linux or Mac, but still made by Microsoft. TypeScript they push forwards, and also of course, I mean, they run GitHub today. Something every developer uses on a day-to-day basis, and yeah, you might also occasionally go to LinkedIn. It's also Microsoft. So they kind of embrace the whole developer community, and in my opinion, it gets harder and harder actually to hate those guys. Quite remarkable. So let's start into demo time, but before that, I just have to show you another clip. Okay, enough of that. No, just kidding. Remarkable. Okay. I want to show you quickly how you would work with Ubuntu today in a Windows environment. So installing Windows is not just like downloading some ISO or mounting stuff or anything. It's actually very easy to integrate it because they go as far as you go to the Windows store, you search for Ubuntu. I don't know why it's in French, my Windows store, but never found out how to change it. And there's Ubuntu. There's not just one Ubuntu. There's 2 versions. And I'm not going to do it now, but pretty much you press install, you press launch, job done. And as a result, you have this. You have an Ubuntu shell. You can also install Debian, or you can install SUSE or whatever, but it's pretty much there on your fingertip. And now you can already start to develop. I mean, you can install Git, you can install Node.js, you can install an Apache, whatever you want. So that's quite great. And the good thing is also they did some very nice things for you. For example, it's too small now, but they actually mount your C drive automatically in Ubuntu, and in reverse, they give you direct access to the Linux file system via Windows Explorer. So if you ever fancy of editing your, you know where I'm heading, your bash RC with Notepad, just kick off, do it. It's possible. So the integration works both ways. It's really nice. It might sound a bit strange, but it helps me. Like sometimes you get an asset or a package or something, so you can actually work really seamless with your Ubuntu installation and your Windows desktop. Because the rest of my desktop, as you can see, still runs on Windows. Yeah. Same for networking. I mean, if you open a service on a specific port, you can access the service in Chrome, whatever, a web server, a database. It's all very, very seamless. So this is quite cool. Next thing, Docker. I mean, development without containers. You can still do it, but it's kind of also a requirement to install Docker. So a question for the audience, where would you install Docker?
Is this WSL 1 or 2?
2.
Okay, so in WSL.
Correct. You would do it in Windows. You could theoretically not install it in Linux, but you wouldn't do that. You would do it on Windows.
So then you're running 2 Hyper-V VMs, one for WSL and one for Docker.
This is correct. So you can see that actually here down here. It's maybe small, but there's one for Docker. So you downstall the installer, you run Docker, and just gonna launch Docker Desktop now. And thanks for the question, because that's something I want to show straight in the beginning. So for the demo gods are with me, Docker is starting. There you go. You would have to double check that you use the WSL-based engine here. And you would also check underneath WSL integration that you install that for your Linux infusion. Why are you doing this? By doing this, actually, there's some black magic happening behind the scenes. But as a result, you can pretty much access Docker straight away from Ubuntu. But you don't need to install any Docker stuff. The same for kube control. Yeah, there's nothing now. Or Docker Compose. That all comes from the Windows installer, interesting enough. But it's convenient. It's because, yeah, there's other ways to do it, but it's convenient, especially as a beginner. Yeah, you all know, got it. I just, for the sake of the demo, I'm just gonna do a little Docker run here. So I have my Nginx running on port 80, and I go to my Chrome on Windows now, obviously, and yeah, what a surprise. I mean, it's running there. So it's quite nice because, yeah, it's very nicely integrated. You can really work with that if you have a Windows, if you're forced to use a Windows desktop. I'm not forced, by the way. It's my own choice. So, especially if you're a beginner, you might find it useful to see like a graphical user interface for your Docker stuff from time to time. It's there, but same time, Pro, just as usually, Docker PS. So there you go. And again, I mean, yeah, there's no magic. If I kill that here, it's gone. Easy. So because it basically shares the whole thing. So this is quite nice because like for stuff you don't necessarily want to install it on Ubuntu, you have the Docker desktop for Windows, and you just spin up your images there and you do your development. So that's very helpful. Next, Visual Studio Code. You already said it. It's also a tool that evolved quite a lot over the years, and it's being used by many developers today. And there's actually also good support for Windows now. Funny thing now, as you can see in default, it still boots like into this Windows mode. So in theory, I could now develop some C# code or whatever. I'm a Windows developer. But if I want to switch in a different world, if I want to develop Ruby or Go or whatever, I have this little connect thing here. And a new thing starts. And it's connected to my Windows subsystem for Linux for Ubuntu. Now if I have a terminal now, that's a bash. There you go. To be honest, I rarely boot into the Windows mode. I always connect like to my virtual Ubuntu machine there. So by that time, if I work with some code, I'm pretty much in the Linux world, or Unix world, or Mac world, or whatever. It's super easy. If you open a folder, that's actually your home folder. So they set the root wherever, in which mode you are. You're either on your Windows Explorer or you are in your Linux home directory. And there are some useful plugins. For example, the WSL plugin. So here you can list all your projects you have checked out on Ubuntu. And yeah, even like if you open recent, you can see there is a little remark here with the Subsystem for Linux. So you can actually see if that's a project that runs on the Linux virtual machine or a project that is native on Windows. So that's quite cool. have to check the time. Yeah, that's good. There's also a Docker plugin. I don't know. I don't use it a lot, but in theory, you can also get a list of your images or start a quick container from Visual Studio Code.
But in this case, your extensions on VS Code work in Linux mode. So path completion and Python don't care what you have installed on Windows.
This is correct. And this is exactly where I wanted to go. If you list your plugins, you can actually see there is local installed plugins and remote installed plugins. So if you would install, for example, a C# plugin, you could have the choice. You can have a local .NET Windows and you develop C# in Windows mode, or you would install the C# plugin on the Linux virtual machine, and the plugin mode is then in Linux mode. So that's quite interesting. In theory, you could also have like whatever, another SUSE Linux or something running in parallel, something completely different, but that's enough for most of my cases. But it works really nicely. Yeah. It's really well integrated, and as a developer, I don't really want to care about all that. I want to start my IDE, I want to check out my code, I want to use my Git, and I want to work with the code. Same is like if you have like a Go project, for example, it doesn't really matter. You set a breakpoint there, and you can debug your code. You can step through all the development. There's no difference of developing natively with Visual Studio Code on a Mac, for example. It just works, which is nice. I really like that. And one thing I forgot earlier on, I actually think, for example, like the development or Docker on Windows is actually faster than on Mac OS X. They have a better way working with the file system. I mean, there's tweaks around it, but I'm pretty sure it feels a bit snappier and a bit better than on Mac OS X. I don't have the comparison to Linux and Docker, but Windows is definitely better than Mac, in my opinion.
Well, we can't hear your fans from here, so I guess you're right.
I have no fans. I'm my own best fan. No, just kidding. The Mac fans, they are like, boo! No, just kidding. Let's go back to presentation. So we've seen Visual Studio Code, and now we've got 10 minutes left. And as a last thing, we want to play with some Kubernetes. And that's also very easy now, because we have already seen there's like kube control is already included in the whole thing. And we've got Docker, and there's an easy way to spin up a cluster. That is interesting, because what we find out, for example, we do like the Kubernetes Academy, and some people turn up with a Windows laptop, so we have a problem. So this way, if the guys are actually developers, if they have admin rights, they can install Docker, and they can do some Kubernetes development on Windows as well. You don't necessarily need a Linux or a Mac OS. Yeah. So let's go to this one, and I have to say I'm not a Kubernetes professional, but there is this tool Kind I have installed. How to complete says delete is from the test. So Kind create cluster. That will take some time, I guess. Doing its magic. That's a good thing. I can actually show you the Windows Task Manager. It's also something useful what's going underneath the hood. So there's VMX. Apparently this thing seems to be like the virtual machine there. So it uses some memory, CPU, it's busy now setting up Linux. That's the virtual machine. One is VLC streaming. And yep, there we go. At least some progress. Something is running there. Kubernetes control plane. It's also there. Okay, there's not a lot there, but you get the idea. So it's very easy. I mean, all I've did pretty much, go to Windows Store, I install Ubuntu, I install Docker Desktop, I ensure it's using Windows Subsystem for Linux. I did not install any kube control, I did not install any Docker binaries. It's just basically there, and I can start working with that. Like I say, I mean, there's still good reasons to use a Mac or to use a Linux, but in my opinion, this is something which is really, really helpful for developers. And it also like kind of opens the door towards all those technologies, because there are still many people who use Windows, but by using the Windows subsystem for Linux, by making all the Linux so accessible for those developers, I think that's a big opportunity. And now I'm faster with my talk, so we have a bit of time for questions, if you like. Tom.
From online. Sebok says, as a Mac fan, this is nice to know that the file system is that fast. Makes me want to try.
Yeah, go for it. Go for it. Any other questions? You?
Have you ever tried the development container feature of Visual Studio Code?
No, I did not. No. What is it? Is it something Docker-like, or?
Yeah, it's like you define a container where all your development tools are installed inside.
Yeah.
And Visual Studio Code actually connects to the container that is like.
Yeah.
It's just another remote end instead of connecting into a Linux.
Okay.
Connecting into a container.
Yeah, I know. I did not know that there is actually something from Visual Studio Code, but I give you like one example. For example, we work a lot with Ruby in this house, and I did not install the Ruby on my Ubuntu or my Windows or whatever. I run the Ruby Docker image, and I boot straight into the console of Ruby, and I work with that. But if there is an integration for Visual Studio, which basically skips that job of spinning up the Docker image, you can tell me after the talk. I'm interested in that. Any more questions? No? I guess in that case, we can hand over to the next speaker. Tobias. Thank you, guys.